At 10:06 a.m., in a glass-walled boardroom where even whispers felt documented, he said it. Clean, loud, irreversible. Your time is over. Get out. A sentence designed to end a career in under 5 seconds. She didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't even look surprised. She simply closed her folder. Precise, unhurried, final. And in that quiet motion, something shifted that no one in the room could name yet. Because what they saw as an exit was actually a transition point. 6 minutes later, a document marked Section 11 would surface on a polished table 2 floors below, and everything they thought they understood about power, authority, and ownership would begin to fracture. The room was designed for dominance. Floor-to-ceiling glass. A table long enough to make distance feel intentional. Chairs that didn't just seat people, they positioned them. At the head sat Daniel Hargrove, CEO for exactly 11 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. Long enough to believe the structure was his, not long enough to understand who had built it. At 10:06 a.m., he adjusted his cufflinks before speaking. A small gesture, but in rooms like this, small gestures were declarations. Your time is over, he said, not looking at her at first. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, get out. A few people lowered their eyes, not out of empathy, out of instinct. Corporate reflex. When something uncomfortable happens, you look at the table, not the fault line. She sat halfway down the right side, not at the head, not even near it. A position that suggested support, not authority. That was the first mistake everyone made. Her name was Elena Voronina, 10 years in the company. No dramatic titles, no aggressive visibility. She wasn't the one speaking the most in meetings. She was the one meetings quietly depended on. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she finished reading the last line on the page in front of her, as if the interruption had been a minor inconvenience, not a public dismissal. Then she closed the folder. Smoothly, without a single extra movement. Click. The sound was soft, but in the silence that followed, it landed like a timestamp. Someone shifted in their chair. Someone else cleared their throat, then immediately regretted it. The air changed, not visibly, but structurally, like pressure adjusting before a storm. Daniel leaned back slightly, expecting resistance, or at least confusion. He got neither. Elena stood up. No rush, no hesitation, just a controlled, exact motion, as if this moment had already been accounted for somewhere long before it arrived. She looked at him then, not with defiance, not with anger, with recognition, as if she had just confirmed something. You're making this easier than I expected, she said quietly, not loud enough to challenge him, not soft enough to be ignored. A few heads lifted. Daniel frowned. I don't think you understand. I understand perfectly, she replied. And that was it. No speech, no escalation, no defense. She picked up her folder, now just an object, no longer a tool, and walked toward the door. He didn't stop her. That was the second mistake. The door closed behind her with a muted seal, cutting off the room from whatever had just shifted inside it. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Daniel exhaled through his nose as if resetting the atmosphere. Let's move on, he said. We have actual priorities. A few forced nods, a few quick glances exchanged, subtle, coded, unreadable. But something had already broken alignment, because there was one detail, small, administrative, almost invisible, that no one in that room had questioned. Why Elena had been invited to that meeting in the first place. She wasn't on the official agenda. She wasn't listed in the attendee distribution. Her name didn't appear in the pre-read documents. And yet, she had been there, sitting, observing, finishing a page no one else had seen, as if her presence had never required permission. Downstairs, exactly 4 minutes later, an internal legal notification was opened. Not flagged urgent, not marked critical, just processed, routine. At least that's how it looked. Until someone noticed the reference line. Section 11, ownership deed, and the percentage attached to it, 60%. At first, it didn't register, because in most cases, numbers like that don't belong to people who sit halfway down the table. They belong to people who sit at the head, or above it. By minute 5, legal had stopped multitasking. By minute 6, someone said, "Wait." And the silence that followed wasn't confusion anymore. It was recalculation, because the name attached to that document was the same one that had just walked out of the room. And suddenly, the question wasn't why she left. It was why no one had ever asked what would happen if she did. By 10:12 a.m., the building was still running on its usual rhythm. Keycards clicked. Elevators opened and closed with mechanical indifference. Coffee machines hissed like nothing had shifted. On the surface, continuity. Underneath, an emerging fault line no one had named yet. On the 12th floor, inside legal, the document was no longer just processed. It was being read, then reread, then quietly isolated from the rest of the morning queue. "Pull the original filing," someone said, voice low, controlled. A second screen lit up. Archive access, time-stamped entries, cross-references, the kind of administrative trail that usually exists to confirm stability, not to question it. But this one didn't behave like the others, because Section 11 wasn't a clause you skimmed. It was a structural hinge, ownership deed, primary controlling interest, non-revocable without dual-party execution. "Who signed this?" another voice asked. "Two signatures," came the answer. "Founding partner and—" A pause. Not hesitation. Recognition catching up with reality. "And Elena Voronina." Silence. Not dramatic. Not loud. The kind that compresses the room instead of filling it. Someone leaned closer to the screen, as if proximity might change what was written. "Date?" "Filed 8 years ago. Amended twice. Last update, 14 months back." 14 months. Before Daniel. Before the restructuring. Before the public narrative of new leadership had even been drafted. A quiet shift in posture moved across the room. Not panic. Something more precise. Recalibration. "Does he know?" one of them asked. No one answered immediately, because the question wasn't informational. It was strategic. Upstairs, Daniel was halfway through a performance review slide. And as you can see, Q3 projections align with... The screen flickered for a fraction of a second. Not enough to interrupt. Just enough to register as interference. He continued. Confidence intact. Voice steady. The room responding on cue. But near the end of the table, someone's phone lit up. A message preview. Internal. Legal. 3 words. Need confirmation. Urgent. The recipient didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, they glanced, briefly, toward the empty chair Elena had occupied just minutes ago. Then back to the screen. Then down again. This time, they opened it. The attachment loaded in under 2 seconds. A scan. Clean, formal, unambiguous. Section 11, ownership deed. Controlling share, 60% holder, Elena Voronina. There was no annotation, no explanation. None was needed. The recipient didn't speak, didn't interrupt, just leaned back slightly, subtle, almost invisible, and looked at Daniel with a different lens than before. Not as a CEO, as a variable. At 10:14, legal stopped asking whether the document was valid. They started asking how it had remained invisible. Was it ever disclosed during transition? Someone asked. No. Board review? No record. Then how? They didn't finish the question, because the answer was already forming, piece by piece, in the space between facts. Not hidden, overlooked, not buried, unquestioned. And that distinction mattered, because one implies intent, the other implies assumption. And assumptions, especially in rooms like these, tend to collapse all at once. Down in the lobby, Elena didn't rush. She crossed the marble floor at the same measured pace she had left the boardroom. No calls, no messages, no visible urgency. At the reception desk, the assistant looked up, uncertain whether to say something. Elena offered a small, polite nod. "Good morning," she said, as if it still was. Outside, the city moved without awareness. Traffic, light, reflections in glass. She paused for a moment near the entrance, not to hesitate, but to observe. Timing. Above her, 12 floors up, a decision matrix was starting to fracture. And no one had announced it. No alert. No escalation. Just a quiet sequence of realizations aligning in the wrong order. Back in the boardroom, Daniel reached the final slide. And that concludes... A chair shifted, this time louder. Not accidental. Intentional. He stopped mid-sentence, looked up. The same person who had received the message was now sitting differently. Less aligned. More independent. "Is there something?" Daniel asked, tone controlled but edged. A pause. Measured. Then, "You might want to check with legal before we finalize anything today." Not confrontational, not detailed, but precise enough to disrupt momentum. Daniel's expression tightened. "If this is about compliance, we've already..." "It's not compliance." The interruption was calm, which made it worse. Another silence. He held their gaze, waiting, expecting clarification. It didn't come. Because by now, the information had already begun to spread. Quietly, efficiently, without announcement. One message to another, one screen to the next. A network activating without needing permission. And the question wasn't circulating loudly, but it was everywhere. How do you remove someone? Who owns the structure you're standing in? By 10:16, no one in legal was multitasking. By 10:17, the boardroom no longer felt like a place of control. It felt like a place waiting for confirmation. And at 10:18, someone finally said it out loud. Not in panic, not in disbelief, but in the tone of someone stating a fact that cannot be repositioned. According to Section 11, she doesn't report to him. A beat, then quieter. He reports to her. Silence. Not the kind that ends meetings, the kind that rewrites them. If this moment caught you off guard, the silence, the shift, the realization, pause for a second. Because this wasn't about a title, not about a seat at the table, not even about authority in the way most people define it. It was about structure, the kind no one talks about until it's already too late. At 10:19 a.m., the word pause finally entered the room. Not spoken, felt. It moved across the table the way a shadow does. Gradual, unavoidable, altering everything it touched without asking permission. Daniel didn't sit down. He remained standing at the head, one hand resting lightly on the table, the other still holding the remote for a presentation no one was looking at anymore. "Let's be specific," he said, voice measured, controlled. "What exactly am I supposed to check with legal?" No one rushed to answer. Not out of confusion, out of calibration. Because the moment you define something precisely, you commit to its consequences. And this required precision. The man who had spoken earlier, the one who had shifted in his chair, finally leaned forward. "Section 11, he said. Just that. No elaboration, no tone. Daniel's expression didn't change immediately, but something behind it did. A quick internal search, a scan of memory, a silent check for context that wasn't there. "Ownership deed," the man added, almost as a courtesy. A few people exchanged glances. Not dramatic, not obvious. Just enough to confirm they were now operating on the same layer of awareness. Daniel set the remote down, carefully, as if control over small objects could compensate for what was beginning to slip elsewhere. And what about it? He asked. The question was direct. The room's answer wasn't. Legal is reviewing a controlling share allocation, someone said. From when? Daniel asked. Filed 8 years ago. Updated 14 months ago. A beat. Primary holder, Elena Voronina. There it was. Not a reveal. A placement. The kind that doesn't explode. It settles, and then everything rearranges around it. Daniel let out a short breath. Not quite a laugh. Not quite dismissal. That's not possible, he said. Too quickly, which made it sound less like analysis and more like defense. No one corrected him. No one confirmed him either, because the document didn't require agreement. It existed independently of reaction. Do we have verification? He asked, shifting tone. Cross-checked against registry and internal filings, came the reply. It's consistent. Another pause, this one heavier, because consistency is harder to argue with than a single data point. Daniel straightened slightly, reclaiming posture. Then why wasn't this disclosed during transition? Silence again. But this time it carried a different quality. Not uncertainty. Reluctance. Because the answer, when it finally came, wasn't technical. It was disclosed. Someone said quietly. Daniel turned toward the voice. Where? In the appendix. A fraction of a second. Then another. Appendix of what? He asked. The acquisition briefing. The same voice replied. Page 183. No one smiled, but something in the room shifted. Subtle, almost imperceptible. Not humor, recognition. Because everyone in that room knew exactly what page 183 meant. It meant not central. It meant not urgent. It meant review if necessary. It meant overlooked. Daniel's jaw tightened. That document was over 300 pages. 312. Someone corrected automatically. Again, no one meant to escalate. But precision has its own gravity. And this, Daniel continued, slower now, was placed where exactly? Section 11, came the answer. A pause. Then, almost as if the room needed to hear it fully formed, ownership and controlling interests. No one moved, not because they were frozen, because they were aligning, with a version of reality that had just become unavoidable. Daniel walked around the table, not quickly, not aggressively, measured, controlled. But for the first time since the meeting began, not entirely certain of his destination. He stopped at the empty chair, Elena's chair, looked at it, as if proximity might offer clarity. It didn't. Where is she now? He asked. No one answered immediately, because the answer wasn't just location. It was implication. Left the building, someone said, at 10:11. The timing landed cleanly, too cleanly. Daniel nodded once, short, tight. Call her, he said. A simple instruction, one that would normally trigger immediate action. It didn't. Phones remained where they were. Eyes didn't drop to screens. No one reached. The delay was brief, but noticeable. Do we have direct authority to request her return? Someone asked. Carefully, not as resistance, as clarification. The question hung there. Not challenging, just exact. Daniel turned, looked at the speaker, and for the first time, the hierarchy in the room wasn't entirely clear. Of course we do, he said. But the certainty wasn't as stable as it had been 15 minutes earlier, because the room now understood something he was still processing. Authority isn't declared, it's defined. And Section 11 had already done that. At 10:23, legal sent a second message, shorter than the first. No attachment, just a line. Recommend immediate board-level review. It reached 3 people in the room, then 5, then all of them. No sound, no notification tone. Just screens lighting up, one after another, like a quiet sequence of confirmations. Daniel didn't receive it last, but he read it last. And when he did, he didn't react immediately, didn't speak, didn't move, because in that moment, the situation had crossed a line from internal correction to structural exposure. He placed both hands on the table, leaning forward slightly, not in dominance, in recalculation, because somewhere between 10:06 and now, the axis had shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but definitively. And the question was no longer whether something had been missed. It was what else had been built on top of that omission. Outside, the city continued. Inside, the room held, waiting, not for data, not for confirmation, but for the one variable no one could simulate in advance: her next move. At 10:24 a.m., the building did something it had never done before. It hesitated, not in motion, not in function. Everything still operated. Doors opened, calls connected, systems processed requests. But underneath the mechanics, a pattern broke. Information had outrun hierarchy. And once that happens, structure doesn't collapse immediately. It distorts. Inside the boardroom, no one returned to the presentation. The screen was still on, frozen on a slide about projections that no longer had a stable context. Numbers without control are just decoration. Daniel remained at the table, hands planted, eyes fixed somewhere between the empty chair and the quiet glow of incoming messages. "Get me legal," he said. This time, someone moved. Not quickly, but deliberately. A call connected. Speaker mode, no introductions. "Legal," a voice answered. "We need clarification on Section 11, Daniel said. "Direct? Compressed?" A brief pause on the other end. Not hesitation. Selection. "Clarification on scope or enforceability?" the voice asked. Precision again. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "Both." Another pause. Longer. Then, "Scope. Full controlling interest. 60% allocation tied to original founding structure. No dilution recorded post-amendment." Each word landed like it had weight. Measured. Irreversible. "Enforceability?" Daniel asked. "Active," the voice replied. "No suspension clauses triggered. No legal grounds for override under current conditions." Silence. Not empty. Dense. Because what had just been said wasn't interpretation. It was boundary. Daniel shifted his stance, barely, but enough for the room to register. "And operational authority?" he pressed. This time, the answer didn't come immediately. You could almost hear the file being opened again. Not physically, structurally, as if the system itself needed to confirm what it was about to say. "Operational authority defaults to majority holder," legal said, "unless delegated." A beat. No delegation currently on record. There it was. Clean, final, unavoidable. Around the table, posture changed. Not dramatically, but consistently. Subtle adjustments. Shoulders, angles, gaze direction. The kind that don't signal rebellion, but do signal awareness. Because authority had just been redefined. Not by announcement, by documentation. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Why wasn't this escalated earlier?" he asked. This time, the answer came faster. Because it wasn't triggered. A pause. Then, almost clinically, "It is now." The line stayed open. No one disconnected. Because no one wanted to be the one to close that channel. Not while the structure was still actively rearranging itself. At 10:27, a new message appeared. Not from legal, from governance. Subject line: "Board review initiated. Immediate attendance requested." No urgency markers, no exclamation points. Just inevitability. Daniel read it once, then again. As if repetition might introduce a different meaning. It didn't. "Schedule?" he asked without looking up. 10:45, someone replied after checking. Less than 20 minutes. In corporate time, that's not a meeting. That's a response. Daniel nodded once. Short, controlled. But the rhythm was different now, because control at this stage is no longer about direction. It's about containment. Prepare the summary, he said. I want everything aligned before we walk in. No one asked aligned to what. They already knew. To reality, which had just shifted ownership. Downstairs, in a quiet cafe across the street, Elena sat near the window. No laptop. No documents spread out. Just a cup of coffee and a reflection in the glass that showed the building behind her. 12 floors of mirrored certainty. She didn't check her phone immediately. Didn't need to. Because timing, for her, was never reactive. It was constructed. After a few seconds, she reached into her bag and placed a thin folder on the table. Not the one she had closed upstairs. Another one. Older. Edges slightly worn. Not from use, but from time. She opened it. Inside, copies, signatures, amendments. Each page aligned with the next in a sequence that didn't require explanation, because the explanation had already happened. Years ago. Quietly. Precisely. She turned to the last page. Section 11. Ownership. 60%. Her name, unchanged. Not highlighted, not emphasized. It didn't need to be. Outside, a car passed. Light shifted across the glass. She closed the folder again. Gently. No tension. No urgency. Just completion. Back in the building, at 10:32, the boardroom was no longer a place of discussion. It was a staging area. Laptops open. Messages cross-checked. Language adjusted. Not to persuade, but to survive scrutiny. Because once something reaches board level, narrative loses value. Only structure remains. Do we know her position? Someone asked. Not physical position. Strategic. Daniel didn't answer immediately, because for the first time, that question didn't have a clear path. She hasn't made contact, he said finally. Which was true, but incomplete. Because silence, in this context, wasn't absence. It was leverage. At 10:36, legal sent one more note. Shorter than all the others. Just one line. Majority holder retains decision priority in board escalation. No explanation. No expansion. It didn't need one. The room absorbed it. Not emotionally. Structurally. Because now the timeline had changed. This wasn't about explaining what happened. It was about who would define what happens next. Daniel straightened. Adjusted his jacket. Small gesture. Familiar. Controlled. But this time, no one mirrored it. No one followed. Because alignment had shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, but completely. At 10:41, the room began to empty. Not all at once, one by one. Measured, silent. Like pieces moving into a configuration that hadn't been planned, but was now unavoidable. And across the street, Elena remained exactly where she was. Not waiting, not watching, just present. As if the next move didn't require action, only timing. And somewhere between the boardroom and that quiet table by the window, a single question settled into place. Not asked out loud, but understood by everyone involved. What happens when the person you removed never actually left? At 10:45 a.m., the boardroom on the executive floor didn't feel like a place where decisions were made. It felt like a place where they were confirmed. Different table, same glass. Fewer seats, but heavier ones. No projections on the screen this time. No slides, no narrative buffers, only documents. And silence that had structure. Daniel entered third, not first, not last. A detail that would have gone unnoticed on any other day. Today, it registered. Around the table, the board members were already seated. Not all of them. Just enough to establish quorum. Enough to proceed. Enough to validate what had already begun shifting elsewhere. At the far end, a chair remained empty. Not symbolic. Reserved. A folder sat in front of it. Closed. Aligned with the edge of the table. untouched. No nameplate. It didn't need one. "Let's begin," said Margaret Ellison, chair of the board. Her tone carried no tension, no curiosity, just sequence. A document slid forward. Printed, signed, stamped. No screen could replace the weight of paper in moments like this. Item 1, she continued. Clarification of controlling interest under Section 11. No introduction, no background, because everyone in the room had already read it. Daniel didn't sit immediately. He placed his hands on the back of his chair, as if deciding whether to engage or to reposition. Then he sat. Controlled, measured, late enough to notice. Margaret opened the folder. "Ownership deed," she said. "Filed 8 years ago, amended twice. Last update 14 months prior to current executive appointment." Each phrase precise, each timestamp aligned. No one interrupted. No one needed to. Because this wasn't new information. It was stabilized information. Primary holder, Elena Voronina, 60% controlling share. The words didn't echo. They settled. Final. Margaret closed the folder. Gently. Not to end the point, but to confirm it. "Enforceability has been verified by legal," she added. "No grounds for suspension or override." A pause. Then she looked directly at Daniel. "Do you contest the validity of this document?" Direct question. No cushioning. Daniel held her gaze. For a fraction longer than necessary. "No," he said. Not because he agreed, because he understood the cost of saying anything else. Margaret nodded once. Acknowledgement, not approval. "Then we proceed under confirmed ownership structure." There it was. Not a shift. A formalization. Because until that moment, everything had been discovery. Now, it was recognition. A second document moved across the table. Shorter. Denser. "Item 2, Margaret continued. Operational authority alignment." No one asked what that meant. They already knew. Under Section 11, majority holder retains priority in strategic and executive directives unless delegation is recorded. She paused. Not for effect, but for clarity. There is no delegation on file. Silence, not uncertainty. Completion. Daniel leaned back slightly. A minimal shift, but enough to signal that the frame had changed. "So what exactly is being proposed?" he asked. The question was composed. Professional, but it carried a new variable. Position. Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned the second document toward the empty chair. Not dramatically. Just precisely. As of 10:11 a.m., the majority holder exited the premises following a public termination attempt, she said. No emphasis, no judgment, just record. Given confirmed ownership, that action has no legal effect on her standing. A beat. However, it does have implications for executive authority. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly on the armrest. "Clarify," he said. Margaret met his gaze again, this time without pause. "Your position is operationally subordinate to the majority holder's authority under Section 11, she said. Pending her directive, your current actions are subject to review. Not removal. Not yet. Something more precise. Containment." The room didn't react, because reaction would imply surprise. And at this level, surprise is a liability. Another board member spoke. Quiet. Exact. "Have we established contact?" A glance around the table. A subtle confirmation. "No," Margaret replied, which meant something very specific. She hadn't responded. Not that she couldn't be reached. A difference that mattered. At 10:49, the door opened. No knock, just a controlled movement of space. Every head turned. Not quickly, not dramatically, but fully. Elena stepped in. No rush, no hesitation. The same measured pace as before. Different room, same presence. She closed the door behind her. The sound, soft, contained, cut cleanly through the silence. No one spoke, because there was nothing to introduce. She walked to the empty chair, her chair, placed her folder on the table, opened it, aligned it with the existing documents as if they had always belonged together. Then she sat, calmly, no claim, no announcement, just position. Margaret inclined her head slightly. A gesture of acknowledgement, not hierarchy, recognition. "Elena," she said, "we're reviewing Section 11. "I'm aware," Elena replied. Her voice carried no tension, no edge, just clarity. Daniel watched her, carefully, not as someone returning, as someone who had never actually left. "You walked out," he said. Not accusation, observation. Elena looked at him, level. "You asked me to," she said. A pause, then softer. "I complied." No irony, no emphasis, just fact. Margaret didn't intervene, didn't need to, because the dynamic had already settled into its correct alignment. "We're moving to authority confirmation," Margaret said. "Any delegation to declare?" Elena rested her hands lightly on the table. Fingers relaxed, posture exact. "No," she said. One word. Enough. Another pause. This one different, because now there was no missing information, no uncertainty, only outcome. Margaret closed the second document. "Then the structure stands as written," she said. Formal, final. And in that moment, the entire sequence, from 10:06 to now, collapsed into a single clean line of causality. Not dramatic, not chaotic, precise. Because nothing had been taken, nothing had been forced. Everything had simply been revealed. Daniel exhaled slowly, not defeat, recognition, because the system he believed he controlled had just demonstrated something fundamental. It didn't run on perception. It ran on definition. And definition had been written long before he arrived. Elena didn't look around the table, didn't measure reactions, didn't reclaim space. She simply reached for the top document, turned one page, then another, as if continuing a process that had only briefly been interrupted. And somewhere in that quiet motion, the final realization settled into the room. Not spoken, not challenged, not even resisted. Power doesn't arrive when it's announced. It becomes visible. When it's tested. Silence. Not empty. Absolute.